I'd like to add to the acknowledgement of the Judge Awarong, whose land on which we meet, and ultimately, if we're talking about housing in this country, you know, that's sitting there in the background, the great dispossession that happened some 200 years ago. And Aboriginal Australians are amongst the lowest in home ownership, of course. So we should, you know, not ignore that part of the conversation. I live just the wrong side of the tracks, just over there. And came to Castlemaine about 7 years ago, being part of the migration from Melbourne, bringing money that's driven up Castlemaine house prices. That's meant that long-term Castlemaine residents, a lot of them have their children can't afford to buy houses here, and I think that's maybe we'll return to that conversation right at the end. Today, I understand is supposed to be a kind of big picture, overarching sort of conversation about housing in Australia and potentially a bit of comparison with what's going on around the world. And there are obviously so many levels we could have this conversation at, and so many different perspectives we could take to talk about it. But clearly, you know, we want the big picture, but the perspective that I think I'm going to take in the next little while is from a sort of social and economic justice perspective, and therefore about affordability really is the key thing. And that picture is largely about land. And there's obviously great experts here about buildings, about the structures. That's not my expertise. My expertise is the kind of bigger scale economic picture, and that picture ultimately is about land rather than about buildings. And I understand in future sessions we'll be talking about specific things that we can do both locally and at a policy level. And so I won't go too much into that either. So this is kind of going to be history, politics, economics. And I'm going to speak for less than half an hour, and then we'll just talk. So in terms of the history and the economics of housing, it used to be in the 19th century that economists talked about economic activity as being labour combined with capital and land to produce wealth. It was kind of how the economy was framed. And labour is obviously enough, that's people's work. Capital in that thinking is buildings, machines, roads, you know, all the kind of things that humans build. And then the land component, which was considered separate from capital, is both the obvious thing of land, just what we stand on, but also the sort of gifts of nature as such. So natural resources, timber, etc. Yeah, water. But at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was sort of change in economic thinking, and at that point, for a lot of different reasons, some of them very cynical, land was rolled in with capital in economic thought. So we just talk about labour and capital now, and land is part of capital. There are very, very good reasons for it being a separate thing. The main one is that you can't make more of it, right? So almost everything else that's involved in economic activity, you can invest in it and build more, short of, you know, creating islands in the South Pacific and in Dubai and stuff, right? At the margins, maybe you can create a bit of land, but not much. Generally, land is restricted, and even more importantly, land close to important other things is very restricted. And this is the key to understanding the big price rises that we see, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. This new kind of brand of economics, neoclassical economics, new classical economics, the classical economists had land separated, they understood the power that land represented, and that owning land is a kind of monopoly. By the money that you make by owning land is what economists call economic rent, which is unearned income. So people who make money just from owning land, they don't do anything to make that money. If you think about buying a house for $95,000 in Chewton and then not doing anything to the house, leaving it alone, selling it some years later for $300,000, you made $200,000 for doing nothing, right? You did nothing. There was no effort of your own that caused that rise in prices. What did cause that rise in prices is the actions of the entire community and government policy. We'll talk a bit about that later. But the thing that causes a rise in prices is the provision of services by government, so schools and hospitals and roads and all that stuff that governments do, plus the activities of all the other people around you who might move into your street and build a house that's nice or do up a house nearby, and just population pressure. So Castlemaine prices are largely going up because more people are coming here. And even though there's plenty of land around Castlemaine and it does get released, there are more buildings being built. The people who are coming in from Melbourne with money don't want to live out there. They want to live close to town, right? Or, you know, they might have different things they want to be close to, but it's those desirable spots close to town, close to the bush. That means they're all bidding up the prices. So the person who bought that land a long time ago is cashing in because of the actions of other people. So that's what I meant by unearned income, which is different from what the word we normally use, rent, which is when somebody pays to rent something from you. If you build a house and you rent it to someone, that's not necessarily economic rent. It's a very confusing thing in economics that those two words have different meanings. Because you do something when you provide a house to someone, right? You're doing something of value. And the same if you rent a car to someone, you're providing something of value. So that's not unearned income, but the land element is unearned. And this is a sort of important. I know it's kind of complicated, and I'm happy to take questions about it later on, or even now if you're confused, just interject. But it's very important from a social justice perspective, and from an economic justice perspective, and from a policy perspective, this distinction between earned income and unearned income. Because from a economic justice perspective, we should tax unearned income. Right? If you want to find something that's good to tax, unearned income is your target. That's economic rent in economists speak. Because it's generally a product of wealth. People sitting on wealth and doing nothing that benefits the people around them, doesn't benefit the community. They're not providing a good or service when they're gaining unearned income. And if we taxed that unearned income from land, we would make it less profitable to buy land and sit on it as an investment, which is what people ultimately do, right? You talk about people buying rental properties. They're not really buying rental properties, they're buying land, and they're sitting on that land waiting for it to go up in value on the assumption that somebody else is going to come along and pay more for it than they did. Because a house, you build a house and you leave it alone, its value goes down because it wears down, right? Things wear out. Unless you spend money on it, the value of the house goes down. People talk about housing prices, and house prices have gone up. It's kind of a misnomer, right? It's land prices that are going up. House prices go down. But that's.
You certainly seem to have a bubble of housing rather than just land. I mean, the housing prices have gone up so much. It's almost like the Dutch tulip craze or something.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
But it's people wanting to be in Melbourne, Sydney, Castlemaine that raises the price of the land.
Well, that's definitely part of it. Part of it is real demand for people wanting to live there. But a big part of it is the demand for buying houses by people who are buying their second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth house because they want that unearned income. And it's ultimately a kind of a Ponzi scheme, right? They're buying these properties at astronomical prices on the basis that they're of limited supply. There's only so many of them, like Bitcoins, right? It's another similar kind of thing, except Bitcoins have no inherent real value. They're buying something that's got limited supply, especially in close to the city where commute times aren't so long, with the knowledge that there will be more people coming along after them who want those properties even more. And they don't, you know, some people do add genuine value to places. They'll buy an old place, they do it up, they spend money on it, they spend time on it, and they sell it for more than they bought it for. That's genuine economic activity, right? But even those people, primarily the money they're going to make is the uplift in the land price during the time when they're doing the work. So the government policy plays a very large role in this situation because primarily because of two taxes, which we have heard lots and lots about recently, which is negative gearing and capital gains tax, and the concession on capital gains tax. And to quickly explain those two things, negative gearing is almost unique in the world, the Australian policy on negative gearing, which allows an investor on a property, on other things too, but we're talking about housing, to deduct the cost of interest and any other costs from the property, and if that exceeds the income they're getting, so if they're paying more in interest for the mortgage and in other costs to maintain the property than they're getting in rent, that loss that they're making can be used to offset other income. So they can reduce the taxable income from their job by owning a rental property that's making a loss. Now, you kind of wonder, well, why would you want to own a rental property that's making a loss? Because they do. Lots and lots of properties in Australia currently make a loss. They don't. It's costing the landlord more money to hold that property than they're making in rent, because house prices have gone up much faster than rent. Rents have been going up pretty steeply, but house prices have been going up faster. So the return for owning a house as a proportion of the investment has gone down. So lots of places make a loss. Why would you own a place that makes a loss? Because you can reduce your tax now on the income from your job, with the only reason to do it is because of the expectation of selling that property later on and making a big capital gain. So the capital gain is the increase in the value of the place between when you bought it and when you sell it.
The really horrifying thing, though, is that it becomes a good idea to leave the property empty. So we've got hundreds of thousands, whatever, of empty properties while the demand is so great for housing that we've got homeless people. So
That's right. Yeah. There's a really clever mob in Melbourne, Prosper Australia, who discovered that you could use water usage for properties, which is publicly available, to see whether the houses were occupied or not. And they discovered that in Melbourne, close to 20% of investment properties are empty. And so you have politicians saying, you know, that this is simple economics. It's a matter of supply and demand. You know, if house prices are going up, we need to build more houses. And then what they do in response is rezone land on the margins of Melbourne from rural to residential, and their mates make, you know, $20 million, the stroke of a pen. And meanwhile, you've got 100-odd thousand houses in Melbourne empty. Deliberately empty.
Negative gearing, people aren't in them because to increase the loss.
So what's that?
People, they don't leave them empty to increase the loss.
No.
It's a different...
That's a different game. Yeah.
So with capital gains, that's a tax.
Yeah. So
If you're not taxed,
capital.
you've made money in a sense, you've had your tax lowered. So when there's capital gains, you don't pay more tax, pay.
Yeah. So hadn't quite finished that train of thought. So I should finish that. The reason why making money from capital gains is so appealing is because there's a 50% concession on capital gains income, which means for individuals and trusts, doesn't count for companies, but for individuals and trusts, you only pay tax on half the capital gain. So if you make $200,000 from selling your house in Tewton for $300,000 when you bought it for 100, you only pay tax on 100,000. And that adds to your sort of normal taxable income, that 100,000, and you pay tax on that. But the effect is that the maximum rate of tax you pay on capital gains is, a bit less than 25%, half the top marginal tax rate, which makes it incredibly appealing investment, right? Especially with governments encouraging people to invest in housing, you can then be pretty well guaranteed that people are going to keep doing that, which means you can play the Ponzi game. You can buy in at $1 million for an old sort of workers' cottage in inner Melbourne, and with the knowledge that a few years later somebody will probably buy it for 1.2 million, and that has been happening, for many, many years now. It just keeps going up and up and up, and it's, the social implications are obviously enormous, among which is the absolute need for 2 full-time working people to own a house in Melbourne. Like you just can't do it by yourself unless you've got some extraordinary job. And so, parents are forced to work full time even though they might not want to. They might want to be spending more time with their children, but really, if we're going to live here, we've both got to work, and then there's childcare and the drawing in of grandparents and to do the parenting and. Plus, of course, there's all the people who just can never do it, who are increasingly being locked out of buying a house. And it used to be that it was just a simple expectation. As recently as the 70s, you could buy houses in Sydney and Melbourne for less than a year's salary. And, it's no coincidence that you can take a whole lot of different social justice and economic justice measures and look at the trends since Federation in Australia and see that, things were pretty rocky up until the Great Depression, and obviously things were terrible then. We had World War II. And then we had a whole different sort of economic, social and political system whereby by most measures things were getting better for people. Inequality was falling. There was sort of a steady improvement particularly in the rights of women, which was heavily triggered by women effectively running the country during the war, and home ownership was high, and that continued. Those trends continued to the early 70s, when the oil shocks really that. Sort of complicated story, but the oil shocks of the 1970s were used by people with wealth and power to undermine the dominant political system, which was a sort of Keynesian system where the government was heavily interventionist, and they jumped on the sort of breakdown of that system during the oil shocks to say, see, it's broken, it's not working, and they came in with what we now call kind of neoliberalism, I suppose, the economic rationalism. It's got lots of different names, and the freeing up of the financial sector was a big part of that. So, almost no one could be paying the sorts of prices for housing that people pay now if it wasn't for the banks, right? People aren't paying $1.2 million for a house, they're paying $120,000 for a house and borrowing the rest from the bank.
Didn't the government sort of cause that by not letting the housing bubble to burst? I mean, during the GFC, both in America and Australia, house prices did start to fall, but both the Labor government in Australia and the Democratic government in America artificially propped up the economy to keep house prices rising.
Definitely.
Surely that would have actually been corrected if that intervention hadn't happened.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hot potato, and it is a bubble, and you know, it's kind of got to burst at some point, right? You can't keep paying a kind of greater multiplier of your salary for a house forever, right? You can't just keep that ratio increasing forever. It's got to burst sometime, but no government wants to be the one who's sitting there when that happens, right? So they do. They you know, first home buyers grants, they'll kind of throw money in, they'll do whatever they can to pass the potato on until it's the next government's turn, in the hope that it's not going to burst on their watch. But that's not the only reason, right? It's not just that they're afraid of the consequences of a downturn. They're also protecting the wealthy, right? Protecting the people with wealth and power, who are the ones who benefit from the current system. And not least amongst them is the banks, right? Sorry?
Why are they so reluctant? I know Labor was sort of playing with it, but Liberals are so reluctant to get rid of the negative gearing. Why is it a benefit to government?
It's not a benefit to government, it's a benefit to their constituents, and the Liberals' constituents are largely the wealthy. Yep. And I mean, there is a genuine fear that, you know, it's a house of cards, right? You tinker with it, it could fall down.
So that might burst the bubble.
And if it falls down, you know, if the house market in Australia collapsed, there's no doubt we'd go into a very deep recession. Right? There's sort of this rolling thing, like the US did. You know, their house market did kind of collapse, as you say. It was they were doing their best to prop it up as fast as they could, but you know, it was running away faster than they could prop it up, and they're still, you know, recovering from the consequences of that, particularly the ripples through the financial system.
The wages growth, which is stagnated. Because in America, wages are very, very low, and some working poor have to work 3-4 jobs.
Yeah.
It's rent a place. Can you see some sort of connection there with our wages going down and housing prices going up? How do we afford to buy something?
Yeah, well,
How about children?
I think rather than a direct connection between those two things are both symptoms of the same phenomenon, which is the kind of financial and political elite running the country in their own interests. And that sort of neoliberalising of the economy, where there's been a concerted decades-long campaign against unions, and so, you know, we're getting off topic a bit here by talking about wages, but you know, the power of workers to argue for a slice of the pie is at sort of, well, at least 60, 70-year lows. The pie's still growing plenty, right? Still plenty of profits in the corporate sector in Australia. Business is doing reasonably well. Profits grew 20% last year. Wages grew 2%. And labour productivity is still doing very well. So, you know, economists will tell you that labour productivity is the driver of wages, and that if people are being more productive and they're producing more goods and services for their time, et cetera, then their wages will rise. It's just a kind of almost a natural force. It's not true. It's broken. Because ultimately it's a story about power and worker powers at, as I was saying, kind of historically low levels.
You were going to talk about the banks.
Yeah. So,
Take us through that a bit. They're all anonymous.
I mean, ultimately, it's the banks who are the greatest beneficiaries of this land price boom, because, you know, every time somebody buys a house for a newer, higher level, right, the banks have to lend them even more money. And interest rates move around, and often people think, oh, the rates are so low, the banks aren't getting very much, right? But it's not true. They're basically always getting the same margin. So their costs rise when interest rates rise, and they lift their margin. So the banks just sit sweet on top of whatever pile is there, right? And you know, I don't kind of know how far to go into the finance and the banking system, but the banks don't have that money that they lend to you. And the bank makes a loan in our modern sort of free market economy, they're creating money. So you go into the bank to get a loan, and they approve it, and then they type the numbers in, and that money is now in your account, right? It used to be the case that the government created our currency. These days, banks create most of the money in our economy. But at the same time they're creating a deposit, they're creating a mortgage. The two null each other out, right? So there's kind of nothing. There's nothing real there. There's a asset and a liability that are equal. And what the banks do, so you might buy a house with that money that you've just borrowed, and maybe you're buying it from a person who banks with a different bank. So that money will then get transferred to an account of somebody in a different bank. What the banks do every day, at the end of every day, they tally up how much money has gone back and forth between each other, and at the end of the day they pay the difference. That's the only real money they need. So if Westpac creates $100 million worth of loans on a day, and Commonwealth creates $100 million worth of loans on the day, and 50 million go either way, neither of them do anything. They don't pay anything. They made that money up and created it out of thin air. And we let them do that, right? We just sort of let the banks take over the role of money creation. And economists say this is an efficient system because, you know, economists are all about supply and demand. And they're saying, well, there's a demand for more money, and this system efficiently supplies that demand. So the money supply is regulated by the demand for money. And if people get more conservative and they pay down debts, the money supply goes down. There's less money because debts have been paid off. So again, I know this is sort of, it's not straightforward, but it's how our current system works, and it's partly how we're able to keep bidding up house prices infinitely, you know, because the money supply can expand when it's debt driven. The money supply can expand indefinitely. Yeah, sorry.
Where does the interest pay on your mortgage come into the picture?
Yeah, so that's real money, right? That's been earned. I mean, it can be paid to you by somebody who's using debt, right? It's kind of complicated, but the interest is the profit. So that's the bit the bank gets that becomes real money. They create money out of nothing, which is not real money because when the debt's paid off, it annuls itself, it disappears. But what's left over is the interest, and that bit's, you know, at least a part of what banks report when they talk about profit, their multi-billion-dollar profits every quarter. Obviously, they make money in a lot of different ways, not just from mortgages, but in Australia, mortgages are a very big part of banking.
So are you saying that inevitably, if it can't keep going logically, and so some sort of crash like America has to happen? And also, a second question, before we were talking about in the ACT where they started to introduce a land tax in a very slow, low-key sort of way, so as not to shock the system too much. How did the banks adjust? What's the implication for the banks there?
Yeah, so there's a few different questions in that. There doesn't have to be a crash, like that's not an inevitable thing, but some sort of moderation at the very least is inevitable. And there are some signs of that happening right now. So Sydney and Melbourne prices have sort of levelled off for the last 3 or 4 months. Well, in this case, I think there's probably multiple causes, but the one that the government's claiming that it's because they've tightened regulations on the banks about lending, so the standards that people have to achieve to borrow, and that has happened, and that's certainly had an impact. I think Labor promising negative gearing and capital gains tax changes if they come into government, and the fact that they're looking like it's more likely they will be the next government at this stage. I reckon that's spooking investors a bit. So some investors are pulling out of the market already because, they don't. It's a bit uncertain. And that's not because, they could buy in now and they wouldn't be affected. These changes would all be grandfathered, right? But if the changes affect the market more broadly and prices drop, then there's no point being in the game. Yeah. So the term grandfathered means they only apply to things from now. So in that case, it would only be house purchases now that are affected by the changes. If you already own a house and it's being negatively geared, you'd be allowed to continue to do that. So the second part of the question was about land tax, which goes back to what I was saying right at the very beginning about unearned income being a good target for tax. So almost all economists of all different stripes think increasing our use of land taxes is a good idea. They're economically very efficient taxes. They're basically impossible to avoid because you can't move or hide land. And in particular, there's a push by economists to get rid of stamp duties, which is a tax on purchasing land. We all know what stamp duties are. You pay some percentage of the value when you buy. And there are lots of reasons why that's a really inefficient way to tax. Partly because it's a big sum to pay, and it reduces people's likelihood of moving, which means we reduce the sort of extent to which we use property efficiently. If there's a place that's closer to your work and might suit you better, and you could sell here and buy there, and the transaction costs will be really minimal, more people will be likely to do that, right? But with stamp duty, if you've got to pay $50,000 to make that move, you're going to commute instead. And the same happens with people who when their kids leave and they might buy a smaller house, sometimes, the money you make by moving to a smaller house and less expensive house is all taken by stamp duty. So, why would you do it?
Of course, in Casimir we do have a lot of people who choose to commute. But obviously, as you're saying, there's local people who are finding it much harder to compete with the prices because of the people that do commute and things like that.
That's right.
So do you think commuting is really a sustainable long-term thing in this area? Because I would say that it's really changed the area quite substantially over particularly maybe the last 12 years, since around 2005, which was sort of the start of the GFC, really.
Yeah, it's definitely changed the town.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. Like in multiple ways, from the perspective of house prices, obviously, but also of people disappearing during the week, just not being around, and the sort of the neighbourhood nature of that, and
less safety on the streets, like sort of from urban planning. I mean, that's Jane Jacobs' sort of idea. The more people who actually live in and work in the area, the more eyes you have on the street, so you sort of know more what's going on, can keep a track of things, that bit of corruption going on, this or that. It's but whereas people are commuting, they have half their life in Melbourne, they don't always see what's going on in town.
I think there's a lot of corruption.
Truly, I don't know what I've heard.
It couldn't meet the employment needs, and so that was a whole policy
Yep.
of the Brakes government to have the fast trains.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a bit different up, doesn't it?
Of course it is, and ultimately one of the potential solutions to crazy capital city land prices is decentralisation, right? is getting people out of the big cities.
And that has happened with when I first came here. The first train to Bendigo was at 10 past 10.
Yes.
It was Melbourne centric. You had to wait for the Melbourne train to come to Castlemaine.
Yeah.
So the only way to get to Bendigo was actually to drive there, or perhaps a school bus. And now, of course, there's trains for that short distance from early on, a few of them. So that's been a change
Yep.
in the last 10 years.
There are quite a few people who commute to Bendigo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story though, because it took 5 years of constant effort to get that morning train, and it could never be agreed to. There was no conception that anyone ever would want to catch a train to work in Bendigo.
I'm just wondering if there. Oh, sorry, you can answer that. Yeah, I'm just wondering in terms of as people, we're agents within this system and perpetuating a system, and I know. I'm guilty of that. I've got a mortgage, but I'm just wondering if there are any examples of where, I'm being a bit idealistic here, but where people have gone, right, I'm not going to sell this house for 3 times the value I bought it for because I don't agree. I'm in the system, and that's real, but I actually don't agree in making unearned income. And so, because I know friends of ours who lived in a community, and there wasn't capping of prices that you could sell on for, and they decided to sell after, I think they built their houses in the 70s, and in the 90s they sold part of the land, and they deliberately sold it for the price they bought it for plus CPI. And it brought quite a bit of division in the community because other people hadn't done that, but they stuck to their guns. And so I'm just wondering if, because I know in Scotland, now some communities are able to buy the land that they have always been tenants on, and they have policy around capping prices on land and houses. So I suppose there's a cohesive vision and movement around that justice. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there's examples in Australia whether you think people that don't have a mortgage can become part of a movement to go, right, we really believe in this, we're not going to make any income out of selling houses.
Yeah,
See what happens.
Like a lot of these things, I think here, you've got to be economically privileged to make that decision, right? In a big way, because if you're moving somewhere else and the land and the prices have gone through the roof compared to what you're selling for, then, so there are some organisations, and there's one, I don't know quite where they're at the moment, but there's one in Castlemaine, community land trusts, where they're trying to break the system to some extent, where there's a trust that owns the land and people buy the houses. And so, and you buy it and you own it and it's yours. You don't own the land that's sitting underneath it, but along with the purchase of the land gives you rights to the bit of land around it. So you've kind of got a yard, you've got, it's
We have one in Castlemaine, but it's just never going
and the
to do anything.
and the problem obviously is that somebody, that's right. Nobody owns land in Canberra, and we were going to talk about that, but we kind of it's one of those conversations. But the problem with the community land trust is somewhere that economic power, that money has to come to get the land in the first place, right? And the trust has to exist, and somehow the trust has to get the resources to get the land. And there are ways that government can intervene in that because as I alluded to earlier, government can astronomically change the value of land by changing the zoning. So, rural land is worth a fraction of what residential land is worth, assuming it's, in reasonable enough proximity to services. And this regularly happens, that land gets rezoned and the owner of the land gets that money, which is just outrageous, right? It's ridiculous. And there's this great book that was published last year called Game of Mates by Cameron Murray and Paul Fritters from the University of Queensland. Game of Mates, it's called, and it's about what they refer to as grey gifts, which are gifts from the government that benefit from government decision making that benefit individuals and companies. And one of the biggest ones is land rezoning. So you've got land bankers, wealthy people who buy the rural land all sitting around Melbourne, knowing that one day they'll have to rezone it and they'll make tens of millions at the stroke of a pen for doing nothing, except sitting on that land. And so not only do they think, oh, well, it's inevitable it's going to happen, but they buy it, and then they employ usually ex-politicians as lobbyists to go into government and tell them to rezone that land. You know, and it's really worth doing. It's worth paying somebody a $250,000 a year salary as a lobbyist who used to be a politician to go to government to get that land rezoned. Yeah.
Just thinking about that whole windfall issue, and sorry, this is a bit out of left field, but there's been talk off and on over the years about either having a massive inheritance tax or doing away with inheritance full stop, which would have, because remember all that, it's like, oh, we're going to lose our inheritance. But no, all the money comes to us through consolidated revenue. So it actually becomes community money, which ends up in a much more equitable society. The difference between rich and poor becomes much less. Housing, we don't have, it solves a huge number of problems, but just wondering what sort of impact that might have, if it's even remotely possible.
Did you want to answer that question?
I was just going to say, I think that if we brought in inheritance tax, like your different system, and you couldn't inherit money, I think that rich people would just give stuff to their kids more.
Oh yeah, there's ways of regulating that. Yeah, there's ways of that's.
But it's,
doable.
I think it's a good idea. Yeah.
I certainly think we should have a substantial inheritance tax. I think there's, both political and practical issues with trying to make it 100%. But yeah, substantial inheritance. There's big inheritance taxes in other countries, and as you say, there's kind of all these ways around them, but then there's also lots of ways to try and stop those ways around them, and there's leakage, it's messy, but it's still a good idea. The land tax thing that we keep almost talking about. So that the ACT, I was talking before about stamp duties and how inefficient they are as a tax. By contrast, land taxes are considered the most efficient of taxes by economists of all stripes. And in the ACT, what they're doing is they're, over a period of 30 years, I think, they're steadily, incrementally reducing stamp duties and increasing land taxes by these little tiny amounts. Until by the end of the 30 years, stamp duties will be gone and there'll be a much more substantial annual land tax. So if you own land, there's just you pay a small proportion of the value of that land every year to the government. And the effect of that is really just to eke back a little bit of that unearned income for the government. Yeah, that's right. And the idea, if you have a sufficiently high land tax, which at the moment the ACT is not aiming for a particularly high land tax, they're just going to be revenue neutral with the stamp duties, which is a good change, but it's not revolutionary. But if you kept that going and increased the amount of annual land tax, then you can have all sorts of really good effects, which is in part, those people who buy investment properties in the capital cities and leave them empty just wouldn't be viable to do it if your land tax gets high enough. And so a lot of those properties would come onto the market for sale or for rent, and that would cause a big increase in affordability.
It's hard if you've got a very low income.
Yes, there always has to be a provision in any kind of annual land tax for it to be deferred until the sale of property, really. That's the only way to make that socially just, because there are lots of people, especially in the capital cities, who were, working class poor and bought these houses in working class suburbs, and then 40 years later they're worth 1.5 million. Now, okay, they're very lucky, obviously. It's not a terrible situation, but if you've got an annual land tax being levied on that, they'd have to move out. You don't want that. So for those.
That reminds me so much. Did you read that book that came out last year, Closing Down?
No.
So that's by this local author, Sally Abbott. She did PR for the Windsor Hotel redevelopment, so she was sort of a PR person in Melbourne. So that was like what you're saying, decentralisation. The government was decentralising development, but because of infrastructure costs, they chose included towns and excluded towns. So say somewhere like Castlemaine fits the included area because we've got a hospital, we've got the rail line that the government spent a lot of, but then there's other small towns that the government stops providing infrastructure for and basically shuts down and people have to move. Well, at the same time, population growth comes into the cities. People are really they might lose their jobs, they might have a lower income, they're forced to sell their houses, developers snap up their houses and buy build a bunch of six-storey units and things. So, but I don't know, that was sort of like a dystopia. Whereas you're sort of saying you think it's like the positive direction of policy development in Victoria.
Well, I mean, increasing density is certainly a desirable thing, I think. I mean, it's one of those classic things, you know, we've moved to Castlemaine, we've got a backyard where we can grow fruit and vegetables and you know, have wildlife in the garden and all that stuff. So I say, yeah, great, more people live in apartments and things. I don't want to. And we've grown up, a lot of us have grown up with an expectation that we'll have a backyard. But, you know, Sydney and Melbourne are full of apartments and people live in them. And some people, you know, not all of those people are doing that because they can't afford a house. Location is a big factor for a lot of people. So, you know, planning is a big part of the solution, obviously.
Part of the sort of rationale of the Australian quarter-acre block was food security. So the idea was that people would have enough land that they could grow their own food if there was like a recession or they lost their jobs or something like that. But when you're in an apartment block, you don't have any sort of way that you can grow a substantial amount of food. Like my grandfather was in World War II and then worked at the bank as a bank manager in Brighton, but he kept up a vegetable patch and fruit trees in his backyard the whole time. Of course, he died and someone developed a mansion with a pool in the garden, so they can't grow their own food at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a self-defeating idea though, isn't it? That if it's with the sort of population levels we have in our big cities, and particularly Melbourne, the idea that we get food security by people having backyards when what we're doing is building on all the best farming land. You know, there's a lot more food security in having dedicated farming close to the city than
I think just talking about population density, that where the houses in the 50s had, you know, a 2-bedroom house with mum and dad and 6 kids, and I think we were only just getting back to the density in that inner area that existed in the 50s. So our expectation now, there's often couples in large houses, which in the past 50, 60 years ago may have had 7 or 8 people in those places.
That's right. I mean, I think there's a whole...
Yeah, so we're talking about density, but it's actually, if you were in a little cottage in Fitzroy in the 40s and 50s, it was a different experience to being in Fitzroy now. Even the density is only similar to what we've got with apartments.
Yeah, and what you've got is data that shows that, you know, we've got larger houses and smaller numbers. And so it's been a complete opposite of what it was in the 40s and 50s.
And I probably should have said right at the beginning, the rough breakdown of cost increases of housing in Australia is about 80% of it is land, 20% of it is cost of construction. And some of that, a reasonable amount of that cost of construction increase is a result of regulation. So, but regulation which primarily is good, so it's making houses comply to sort of more stringent standards about energy and flammability and so on. So that's kind of, at least in part, why I chose to speak about land today, because 80% of the affordability issue is about land. And people are pretty powerless about that. And so 90% of the energy goes in, of people dealing with housing affordability goes into thinking of ways to share the land or to build a really small house so that that component of the expense is reduced because they feel there's nothing they can do about the cost of land, which individually is true.
What can we do about the land
Yes.
thing?
Yes.
Warwick, can you give us some message today or something about, I can't wait till I gets in and it's probably fixed or whatever it's going to be, or, the Greens will get in power and fix it, or we'll go and have a Occupy movement, or, where is, or your think tank will be,
Yeah. I think it's politically, as I was sort of talking about before with the hot potato, it's really difficult politically because there are lots and lots of levers government have that can reduce land prices, but we're still a majority homeowner country, even though the numbers are falling. They're falling, reasonably sharply. I think still 60% of people or something live in are owner occupiers, and they see their home as kind of like a bank, and it's an illusion, of course. If you only own one house and prices are going up everywhere, then the benefit to you is pretty limited. It's true that you can use the equity in your house to borrow money to go on holidays and stuff like that. So that that you can do it, but most people don't actually. Most people don't use the equity in their home to do other things. So the real benefit, obviously, is people who own more than one house. But the perception is there if you're a homeowner that rising house prices are good, and so governments, of course, they have to say, oh yes, we care about these young people who can't afford to buy houses, and we're doing everything we can to help them. And what they do to help them primarily is things like the First Home Buyers Grant, right? So they give money to somebody, and say these people have saved $50,000 to buy a house, and they could buy, leverage that, buy a house worth $500,000, get given another $5,000. Now they can buy a house with $550,000, right? So they'll bid their prices up. You give more money to buyers for a limited resource, the effect is so. Cynical economists like me refer to those as the First Home Vendors Grant, because really the government is giving that money to people selling their houses, right? And they're not just giving that money though; they're giving leveraged, so that money leveraged. So they're giving 10 times that money to the people who are selling houses.
My question is, are there models elsewhere, even in other countries perhaps, that are successful that we could look at and then find ways to let our governments know that this is what we want?
Yes. There's this old joke, of a family driving the outback, and they're lost, and they see a farmer leaning on his fence post, and they pull up and say, "How do we get to Sydney from here?" And he goes, "Geez, mate, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here." Right? Yeah. And that's kind of where we're at with this. There's plenty of better examples overseas, but there's no examples I'm aware of where a country was where we are and they fixed it. So, yeah, that's right. Well, it's not impossible. It's just a kind of, like, if you had a well-intentioned enough government, I think what they could do is play a nuanced long-term game of holding house prices kind of flat while wages rise, right? So basically just slowly, steadily improving affordability over time, right? But, where is the political will and vision to do that kind of thing, and the skill to communicate to people why that's a good idea? So ultimately, I think the answer is that we collectively, as a nation and as a community, have to be ready for when the crash happens and then change the rules. Right?
Or when the American GFC happens, or when the American bubble, what happened there happens here?
That's right. And the reality is almost nothing changed there, right? And the reason was because there wasn't a kind of coherent, well-championed alternative waiting in the wings for that moment. It's the same thing as the story I told before about the neoliberals waiting in the wings for their chance, and the oil shocks gave them that chance, right? So there was a crisis, and they said, this is why that crisis happened. This is how we can make sure it never happens again. So I think from per capita's perspective, you know, I was kind of meant to introduce myself a little bit at the beginning and say a bit about per capita, but I didn't. It's a progressive public policy think tank, and we try to play that longer term game. I've only been there 2 years, but per capita has been talking about negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions for 10 years. And back in the early days, that was completely politically untouchable. But there's just been a slow, and you know, we can't claim credit for it ourselves, obviously, by ourselves, but there's been a steady increase in that conversation and a growing awareness of what it means and why it's really only the very wealthy, and you know, they're raking in all this money at everybody else's expense. That now the Labor Party is you know, currently holds a policy of changing those things, even though, you know, they're kind of tinkering a bit. They're not completely reworking it, but.
Did you say that was due to Bill Shorten as leader? Obviously, after Kevin Rudd sort of was turfed out by Shorten and Gillard, and Gillard was turfed out by Shorten again, and now Shorten's got the upper hand in the Labor Party.
It's only because he thinks he might win with it.
Oh, well, the media is so, like, they really stuck up to Bill Shorten so much. The arts media in Australia are terrible.
I don't think Shorten's driving most of the progressive. The Labor Party right now, though.
So you say other members of Parliament in the Labor Party, along with Shorten, are kind of going in that direction.
Yep.
Okay,
well,
interesting.
I mean,
we don't always hear about the ones who aren't the key.
No, that's right. My impression certainly is that Shorten's kind of being dragged. But the Labor Party right now are genuinely more open to reform and progressive left reform than they have been in probably 40 years, I reckon, since Whitlam.
Because of Jeremy.
We meet with members and ministers and their staff, and you know, we come from a reasonably radical left perspective, and we say stuff that in the past would have just been, and instead they're taking notes, right? It's different. It's a different feeling. It's a different feeling.
We're getting into a tax crisis now.
A tax crisis.
Budget crisis, that there's not going to be enough money in the coffers.
Yeah, which you know, we could have another whole session on that, which we did at Democracy for Dinner. It's a constructed crisis. There is no crisis. We've had budget deficits more than 75% of the time since Federation, and the deficits have, on average, far outweighed the surpluses. We had massive deficits during World War II. They were never paid off. You know, the years after World War II were considered the post-war boom. You know, those were the golden years when everybody was doing really well. And if the rhetoric of today was to be believed, the post-war generations should have been slaving under all that debt to pay it off. They didn't. And those years were deficit governments as well. They weren't surplus governments paying off the debt. They were deficits as well. And the reason is that, you know, the federal government economically and by its balance sheet bears no resemblance to a household or a business. You know, the politicians are constantly saying this. Just like a household, we have to make sure that, you know, it's rubbish. They own the currency, right? They own the Reserve Bank, and the Reserve Bank can never run out of money.
So is that the neoliberal kind of way of keeping people?
Yeah, it's part of the same conversation. Like, really, in the post-war years, they thought their focus was full employment, and they achieved full employment by spending whatever was really necessary to achieve full employment. And if that meant a deficit, then that was worth doing because we have full employment and a good, you know, and a strong economy, and that was explicitly stated. There's a 1945 white paper from the Curtin government that says exactly that. It says, you know, the worst outcome from capitalism is unemployment, right? if we want all the benefits from capitalism, which we think we do, we think capitalism's a good model, it provides all these benefits, but it has costs. And they acknowledged the costs, and they said, well, if we're going to have this capitalist system, we need collectively to take responsibility for the costs. And one of those big costs is unemployment. And so the government said, well, we will use our spending power as the federal government to keep the economy ticking along at a rate which achieves full employment. And for 25 years after that white paper, we had 2% unemployment in Australia. Come to the 1970s, oil shocks, we've never gone back.
Warwick, you talked about needing to have a coherent and a well-championed alternative as a kind of way that we need to be almost to be ready for that. I suppose, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I suppose the thing is that there's the possibility of that within the existing paradigm, but there's also the possibility of that in. Because I suppose part of the challenge for me is that what you're saying is that neoliberalism, and I think a lot of us in this room are feeling that neoliberalism is absolutely letting us down. So do we, and yet change is also very challenging for communities. So I suppose my question is really about how do we need to almost have two kind of alternatives that we're coming up with, one that is within a system that can gradually shift us towards something that is a completely different paradigm and a different way of doing it.
Yeah. At per capita, we consciously play those two games. Like we go into a meeting with politicians, and the game we're playing is, you know, here are all these things that you could do now that would make a difference and that, you know, hopefully will be palatable to the electorate. But then the other thing we always try and do is change the public conversation about things that the politicians will not do now, that just are not touchable, which is that, you know, it's like that thing about negative gearing. Talking about it back in the days when it was totally politically toxic. So, I mean, I think you're right. Maybe there's even more levels. Like one level is effectively, you know, when the revolution comes, we nationalise land, right?
Yes.
And as was kind of alluded to earlier, and we kept never quite having that conversation, but nobody owns land in the ACT. It's all owned by the federal government, and it's all on 99-year leases, or some are shorter. But and that gives them greater capacity to tinker and reform and you know, there's a few. We were talking about international examples before. South Korea, the government owns 50% of the land, and as a result, they can use that kind of rezoning power of government to fund affordable housing. And so there are a few, you know, there are a few international examples. Basically, it's the Anglo-Saxon world that's got this housing problem. So the sort of English-speaking.
The last Five Eyes plan then, so you were saying it's really gone down. So the last Five Eyes plan was from 1990 to 2015, which was the neoliberalism, wars in the Middle East, anti-Islam 25-year Five Eyes plan, whereas the Curtin government was sort of the start of the 40-year Five Eyes plan, which was the welfare state, keeping up full employment, being anti-communist, so you have the wars in Vietnam, etc. Although that caused a great amount of controversy, of course. So now we're coming up to the 2020 long-term plan. Like, really there's room for a different approach from either the welfare state long-term plan or the neoliberal long-term plan.
I think there's pretty broad acknowledgement, even amongst those sorts of circles, that neoliberalism is breaking down. And, you know, the people who run the world are scrambling for a new way to dominate. And I think, you know, it means there is opportunity. There's always opportunity in change. Anitra.
What sort of influence do you think on prices does the fact that our state government thinks that we're going to sort of double our population in the
Yeah.
next 30 years have. Like, big demand.
Yeah, clearly population's a big issue, but I think it is overplayed as an issue. There's no way around the idea that you've got more people, you need more houses. If you're not building enough, then prices are going to go up. But we are building enough. And, there's plenty of housing for the people who are coming. So if we keep doing it, obviously, we've got to keep up that building, but historically at least, the issue has been more about investors bidding up prices and competing with homeowners than it has been about population. Population has played its role, particularly in sprawl. So I think this is I'm unresolved in my own mind about Australia and population policy and what we should do and where we should stand. But yeah, it's part of the picture, obviously.
The other issue that's often raised by housing policy people is that if we had more public housing, more social housing, then we'd more or less have a ceiling on prices, and it'd have a really positive impact in terms of what investors can ask for in the private rental market.
Yeah, so that's a good thing to bring up because we haven't really talked about public housing and social housing today, and the public and social housing stock all across Australia has been run down, sold off to these public-private partnership nonsense things that are generally just another way for governments to give money to their mates, or to just get stuff off the books. It's like, oh, there's this crumbling public housing development, and it's going to cost us millions to redevelop it or fix it up, and you guys deal with it and make a mozza at the same time. We, per capita, made a submission to Treasury about a model. And this is one of those, how can we play within the current system to get more public housing, which suggested that state governments, we could set up a national kind of land aggregator developer organisation that was owned by the government, but semi-independent with its own charter, that took land from state government, developed it for public housing, sold very small proportions of that housing to cover the gap between the rent you get from public housing and the rent you get on the market, and then gave that land back to either the state governments or to community housing operators to manage. Because at the moment, the community housing organisations are doing everything. They're managing the properties, they're managing the tenants, they're supplying the tenants with services, they're being developers and they're being purchasers, and and they're not doing any of those things really well. The thing they do best is manage property. And so if you can take all those other functions off them, and use the state government's power to rezone land, because state governments still own a reasonable amount of land. If you can take the state government's power to rezone land and create wealth, you can create that wealth, sell a little bit of it to fund that margin between commercial renting and public house rents, and then give it back to the.
Because you'd only sell it once, wouldn't you? Because you have ongoing costs.
Well, so as an example, the government, the Victorian government, might give this body an existing bit of public housing that's relatively low density, and it might be redeveloped higher density, and the development overhead is gained by the authority who's doing the work, rather than selling it off to private to make that developer margin, because there's always a big developer margin. That margin is kept in-house, so it's kept within the public housing system. And then they'll sell a few of those dwellings to cover the margin between, to make the difference between the rental return from
but what
affordable
I mean is
housing.
the rental return will always be lower than the market.
Yes. So it's got to have some time period. It's got to have some time horizon, obviously, which that's calculated on. Yeah.
Do you put out position papers for us to read?
Yeah. Yep. So.
We can just access them just online. Is that right?
Yeah. Normally you can, except our website is very broken right now.
Now, if you want to have a look at the conversation, you can search and find there's an article that covers quite a bit of what you talked about today.
Yeah, there's a housing and tax paper on the conversation.
Four tax policies on Australian house prices, which I've written all over. It's my note paper, so that's in the conversation. That's a few years old now. But if you search for Warwick on the conversation and a couple of other places, you'll
The Guardian.
The Guardian.
Yeah, ABC. Yeah.
Now, Warwick, is there anything else you want to? We'll just sort of wrap up in a minute. We might. Anything else you wanted to round off with, and then we can go. Obviously, still be here in individual conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are, in terms of that sort of waiting in the wings thing, well, what we can do if an opportunity presents itself. Germany is one example of a country that's played this game much better than we have, in terms of, and much of continental Europe really, but particularly renters' rights.
So I've been to talks at Melbourne Uni with German people from Germany, and they really think they have quite a disapproving attitude towards Australia on a number of policy issues, climate change, housing. It's not just a difference in policy. They really show a disapproval, is my experience.
It's not surprising.
Yes.
Yeah. So, in much of Europe, renters have much stronger rights. They have longer leases. Renting for life is just not uncommon, and it's not considered a sort of second-class option in many places. And the government takes a much stronger hand in controlling real estate prices. So there's sort of firmer regulation. It's done in lots of different ways in different countries. From some, like, as I said, there's sort of Singapore and South Korea, where the government owns 90% of the land. And sort of Germany, Singapore, South Korea, handfuls of other countries in Europe, you look at the comparison of house prices, and they just never had that explosion that occurred from the 70s once mortgage lending was unrestricted. Just never happened. So their house prices have just sort of ticked along as a similar proportion of income.
What was it about Germany that made you use them as an example, particularly of the fact that they've handled it much better? How would you describe what they've done much better?
Can you answer that question? No? So I thought we should defer to the German. What they primarily just by being very conscious about it. So there are lots of different ways of explaining it, but the main reason is that it's not very beneficial to be a landlord there. So the return from being a landlord in Germany really is just the rent that the person pays, which is very comparable to other relatively safe investments. So, you get a bit more in rent than you'd get from having your money in the bank. Not a huge amount more. Investing in a genuine business that's doing really good things is going to get you a better return. And so the Germans largely do that. So, they've got these sort of safe assets, and there's a safe mix of interest-bearing bonds, and, this is the big money, right? And some in real estate. But they invest very heavily in their own domestic companies, and you see that in their economic record as well. Germany's often referred to as the powerhouse of Europe. And they don't, because they broadly across their economy, they actually waste less money on, or less resources getting economic rent, seeking unearned income, and more seeking earned income.
Now, we're just going to leave it there, I think. Thanks, Warwick.